Lithuania plans to close more border crossings with Belarus. With 2 checkpoints already shut after Minsk offered shelter to Wagner mercenaries, Vilnius is now discouraging residents from any travel to its eastern neighbor. So, where do Lithuania's security fears leave its people, as well as its relationships with Minsk and Moscow? I'm Maryia Sadouskaya, and today's newsmaker is the Lithuania-Belarus border. In recent years, Lithuania has become a refuge to those fleeing a political crackdown in neighboring Belarus and increased repression in Russia. The country is a member of NATO and the EU and supports Ukraine in its war with the Kremlin. But now, Lithuania, along with Poland and Latvia, say they are facing ever-increasing threats along their eastern fronts, not least with the growing presence of Wagner fighters given refuge in Belarus. But with Lithuanians making almost 250,000 crossings over the Belarusian border in just the first half of this year, how can Vilnius best ensure its security without hurting its people?
Nothing is good about it. It's people's livelihoods. There are relatives. There are businesses. I am against that. We cannot meet our neighbors.
I think it's wrong because people are suffering from it. We live here, we are born here, and we have relatives there, and for us, this is inconvenient.
Lithuania shares a nearly 700-kilometer border with Belarus. There had been 6 border crossings until 2 were closed in recent weeks, in large part due to Minsk providing shelter to mutinying Wagner Group fighters. Around 4,500 Wagner mercenaries are believed to have set up camp at a military base in the village of Tisel, some 90 kilometers south of the capital Minsk. But there are concerns some soldiers have been moved to northwestern Belarus. In July, the Polish Prime Minister said more than 100 Wagner fighters were stationed close to the city of Grodno, near the Suwalki Gap, Poland's 100-kilometer border with Lithuania, that separates Belarus and the Russian enclave of Kaliningrad. Well, Poland has also sharply restricted access from Belarus. Last month, it sent 10,000 additional troops to the border region following an alleged incursion by Belarusian military helicopters. The Prime Minister has also warned that Wagner fighters could pose as migrants and enter the EU.
The Wagner Group, which is under direct guardianship, direct supervision of Putin and his people, will be used more than before, or at least to the same extent as until now, as a tool for provocation, blackmail, attacks, and all kinds of actions to disrupt the security policy and destabilization of countries bordering Russia and Belarus.
Meanwhile, Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko has called Lithuania's decision to close border crossings far-fetched and counterproductive.
The leadership of Poland and the Baltic countries accuses Belarus of some mythical, aggressive intentions that have never existed and cannot exist. They are whipping up hysteria about the presence of Wagner private military company employees on our territory. They have reached the point where they are already demanding their immediate withdrawal from Belarus.
So Lithuania and Latvia, as well as Poland, all feel measures need to be taken along their Belarusian border to protect themselves. But are such fears merited? And if so, what should be done and at what cost? Well, joining me now to debate that are from Warsaw, Maryia Sadouskaya-Komlach. She is a journalist and non-resident fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis. From Minsk is Yauheni Preiherman. He is the founder and director of the Minsk Dialogue Council on International Relations. And from Washington, Katsiaryna Shmatsina, a researcher at Virginia Tech University, specializing in Eurasian politics and security. Thanks all so much for being with me. I will begin in Minsk. As we just heard there from President Lukashenko, Yauheni, you seem to think a lot of the fears of Belarus's neighbors are also exaggerated. But given what's happened to Ukraine, on its Russian border, and that many see Belarus as an extension of Russia, Why shouldn't Lithuania, in this case, be concerned?
Well, the simple answer is that the realities, including the structural realities that Lithuania, Poland, and Latvia face on their border with Belarus are qualitatively different from the realities that Ukraine face on its border with Russia. Lithuania, Poland, and Latvia, as we all know, are members of NATO. They are covered by NATO's Article 5 and by the commitments of the entire alliance to defend those countries, including as the rest of the NATO territory. Plus, as we recently heard, not just from the Belarusian president, but also even more recently from the Lithuanian president, I think as late as this morning, he said he no longer sees any major threats emanating from the Belarusian territory that required any drastic measures like the entire closure of the border. So I think even in those countries, there is a realization that these realities are really, really different. And I think, if anything, we also clearly saw that, at least to an extent, the fears, especially in Poland, were driven not so much by what was really going on in the Belarusian territory, but more so by the domestic political situation. Poland is facing a parliamentary election in mid-October, and even the mainstream Western media, American media, now reporting about the intentions of the governing coalition in Poland to use the situation of the Belarusian border just to increase its popularity in society. So I think we need to pay attention to those things as well.
Okay, let me ask Maryia then. Well, based on what Yauheni has said, is Lithuania just either being overly cautious or even overly political in its decisions?
Oh,
Go ahead.
Let me first address the Polish commentary, because I think this is the reality when Belarus is so isolated and people from Belarus are not able to really frequently travel abroad. Sometimes the political lens is a little bit, I would say incorrect there. If there is one thing on which all political forces in Poland agree, even the most radical ones, except for very open pro-Russian, it's actually how to treat Belarus, and how to treat borders with Belarus, and how to treat the support to the Belarusian opposition. It is much less politicized issue in Poland than everything else. So the border with Belarus is more the issue of course, unstopped flows of Middle East and North African migrants that have been there since 2021, and the necessity to keep or not keep the wall. Of course, it will be used during the election, but definitely it's not the point that would make people agree to support Law and Justice and its coalition or the opposition, because when opposition comes to power, and if it does, it would probably continue exactly the same policy in this regard. Coming back to Lithuania, I think Lithuania is just a much smaller state, and while NATO protects its members from open military threat, of course, all the hybrid threats posed either by this illegal migrant flows or recently the private army of Wagner stationed on Belarus was something that Lithuanians felt much more worried about. And right now they will be using this closure, non-closure of the points on the border as one of the little instruments of diplomacy they got in their hands to kind of check if the Belarusian regime is ready to make more provocations or would stop on the current level.
Okay, is it a point of diplomacy, though, do you think? Or, I mean, could that potentially backfire? Because some, in the Russian sphere will see what Lithuania is doing as another so-called provocation.
Well, I mean, there have been mutual accusations of provocations, and there are a lot of going on in the waters and the skies and so on. But what Lithuania does, it has been doing before during coronavirus, during the initial waves of migrants that started entering its territory back in 2021. But Lithuania will not be pursuing it too much because, of course, every time it closes the point on the border, the flows of Belarusians wanting to leave the country or to just go abroad go disproportionately to Latvia. We just heard news about Latvian borders being kind of suffering from that, right? Or to Poland. So therefore, it's important that all the Baltic states and Poland have a joint position on that, and they're trying also not to be unfair to each other.
Okay. Let me get, I can see you very much disagree, Yauheni, but let me get, I'll come back to you, but let me get Katsiaryna into the conversation first, because you believe fully there are reasons for all neighbors to see Belarus as a security risk, also because of the presence of those Wagner fighters we talked about in the country. What does Lithuania fear those in particular, those fighters could do? Because some say these are the ones that, primarily the ones who mutinied against the Kremlin. Is there still reason to believe they are dangerous to Lithuania and to other neighbors?
I wouldn't say that as of today, Belarus presents an imminent threat to its neighbors that, I don't know, like Belarusian army is gonna attack NATO's eastern flank. Not really, but in the longer run, given that there is an ongoing conflict, the war, and Belarus is sort of the accomplice, or Belarusian regime is the accomplice of that war, it makes sense for NATO allies and particularly Baltic states to consider that Belarus could be a threat one way or another, and there could be threats, sort of hybrid attacks, or if you're talking about Article 5 for this matter of the NATO charter, well, it has been sort of a matter of debate if Kremlin would try to possibly launch some sort of hybrid attack or some blatant attack on one of those smaller states with the NATO alliance to actually test the waters. How strong is the alliance? Because are they actually going to use the sort of retaliate, use military response, or how strong is overall like NATO alliance? But again, like this is not an imminent threat. This is just one of the calculations, possible scenarios, which totally makes sense for Baltic states to care about their security in the longer run. If we're talking about Wagner Group, well, again, this is one of the calculations that they could be possibly used for some sort of hybrid attacks or for some sort of diversions on the border. Doesn't sound, again, like as a very realistic or imminent scenario at the moment, but I just want to remind that there was a migration crisis sort of orchestrated by orchestrated by the Belarusian regime, most likely facilitated by the Russians in 2021. This migration flow continues, and again, like it's not a sort of something that is happening organically. It's not that those migrants actually decide to come to Belarus. There has been some efforts by the Belarusian regime to orchestrate so.
Let me just be clear, though, that you think that the measures, Lithuania in particular, the measures they are taking are pretty acceptable given the conditions? They're not actually provocative and they don't run the risk of backfiring? Or do you see an element of that there?
So I would say that the measures that the Lithuanians have been taking, they just crossed two crossing points at this point. So it's not that they're closing the border entirely. And I would also bring up that there are some sort of provocations by the Belarusian border guards that, let's say, like the Polish side reports when those border guards try to present them or try to present themselves as migrants, even throwing stones at the Polish counterparts. So this is part of the tension sort of staged by the Belarusian regime, sort of to create a sense of insecurity that sort of to create some sort of distraction for
so
the NATO.
There are also, I guess you're saying there are also issues on a very micro level here that need to be considered as well for certain policy decisions. What is actually happening specifically at these very border crossings between the individual guards that are actually there. Those are being taken into consideration as well. We haven't quite described them, but you just have. But let me get to Yauheni. I saw you had a response earlier to what you were hearing. Let me hear that first. Go ahead.
Well, first of all, let me say that, I'm someone who crosses this border between Lithuania and Belarus on a regular basis, and there are no major or any other issues there. That's why I think we need to get a correct picture of the situation. And if anything, it's not about any micro issues between the countries. It's all about a very major issue, which in the academic world is known as a security dilemma. In other words, we've reached this point in relations between NATO on the one side and then Belarus and Russia on the other side, whereby each side sees any moves by the opposite side as malign. And that's a real problem. That is something we all need to pay particular attention in order to prevent any further escalation. But to do that, and here I get to the diplomacy part, which we mentioned before, I think what was said Lithuania and Poland using these potentially coercive measures as instruments of diplomacy does not make sense, because as we know from the theory of diplomacy, if you want coercive measures to help your diplomatic efforts, then you need to have those diplomatic efforts together with the coercive measures. In other words, you need to talk. And what we are observing these days is that in response to this recent wave of escalation, Minsk has offered nothing else but transparency and trust building measures. In particular, there are ongoing military exercises by the Collective Security Treaty Organization on the Belarusian territory. And Minsk decided to invite Poland and Lithuania. And what do you think the response was? The response was silence. So that's why, when silence dominates this whole discussion, it's really difficult for me to understand how coercive measures, including full closure of borders, can work as a diplomatic tool. And the very same with Wagner. I understand there are so many narratives in the media, and we're already lost about those narratives. But if we're researchers, we need to look at facts. Even from day one of this Wagner story on the Belarusian territory, there was no capacity whatsoever by Wagner to do anything really dangerous to Lithuania, Poland, or any other NATO country. Because they didn't even have enough weaponry there. They had to hand over all the weaponry to the Russian Defense Ministry. And if anything, the final thing I want to stress, to make facts clear, NATO passed all the necessary decisions at the Vilnius summit just over a month ago, where they now have very strict plans how to react to any possible serious provocation if it does happen at any point. So Lithuania and Poland, for that reason, do not need to close the borders. There are instruments at play.
Several points I want to raise with you, Yauheni. I'm going to stick with you for a second, because first point being, you say you cross these borders, you used to cross these borders all the time. Then how tragic is it really for the people, especially in Lithuania, but as well as other Baltic states, that are now being cut off effectively from their neighbors? And I don't know, is there worries that kind of ethnic separation is in part what may have sparked the Ukraine conflict to begin with, and that again, this is unfairly provocative to people on the ground that are just being separated because of this border and their language and ethnicity?
Well, strategically speaking, it's extremely dangerous and extremely damaging, because if anything, if such moves are to happen, they will basically damage those interpersonal, intercultural, business, and any other personal contacts that have always kept this part of the world together. They will undermine the whole political economy of this region and the political economy of regional security in Eastern Europe. And that will have very negative impact, as I already said, to specific people on both sides of the border. And by the way, I see a lot of Lithuanians or Latvians or even Poles coming to Belarus these days. So if they come, then possibly they find something of interest here, either personal ties, either business connection, or something else. So all this is going to be ruined. And then on a bigger scale, this is going to be a strategic problem for regional security. It's very easy to dismantle things, but then it takes years, if not generations, to put them together. And sometimes those things are not even possible.
Okay. Maryia, go ahead.
Yeah, well, first of all, I would like to agree with Yauheni that if this continues, indeed, it would be a devastating effect on a small cross-border movement. But if we look back, while actually the travel from and to Belarus have been restricted, the air travel was banned when Belarus made the Ryanair flight with blogger Protasevich sit in Minsk just to arrest 2 bloggers from the opposition. So I think if we do not look back into which exact move of a Belarusian regime, such as supporting the migration, making the Ryanair show, also very openly on propaganda outlets claiming that they would be persecuting opposition, including in Lithuania, for what they did, starting the criminal trials in absentia, makes this political moves happen, even without outside the context of the war. We would be blaming only the current war situation on this alienation between Belarus and the neighboring states. However, unfortunately, since 2020, the rhetorics of the Belarusian government towards its neighbors, and especially pro-state media, which are paid by the government, has been increasingly negative, increasingly following the Russia example. And we know that Russia stopped any real diplomatic talks since the invasion of Ukraine and moved into slogan diplomacy, into actually transferring into private conversations with diplomats all the slogans that are, for example, told on the state TV. So the side starting the slogan diplomacy instead of real talks was not NATO, was not the EU, it was Belarus supported by its big neighbor Russia. And it will take months and years and not just one-off invitation to the military drills to restore this trust. And I would agree here with Yauheni that it would be for the benefit of everyone in the region if Belarus again is seen as a separate political player. Right now, the invitation was declined probably just because Belarus is not being seen as an independent player anymore. No one knows what Belarus decides on its own as a government and what is being dictated or being very closely communicated with the Russian government. Therefore, as I said, the closure of the borders is not diplomacy. It's the tools they're using instead of diplomacy, because all the diplomatic measures seem to have failed in the last 3 years. And I do hope that after demonstrating these closures, they would go back to the dialogue.
Katsiaryna, go ahead.
Yeah, so I wanted to say that the border movement, trans-border movement, I wouldn't say like it's a big issue that those crossing points were closed by the Lithuanian side at this point. And I want to bring up that there is a bigger issue or inconvenience or even a threat for Belarusians coming back home, either those who have lived in EU for a long time or those who are just visiting as tourists and coming back. What I mean is that Belarusian border guards are taking severe measures now, even deploying sort of KGB officers to interrogate certain people who look suspicious, who were allegedly involved into opposition activities. Their phones have been searched. People could be detained, and at the very least, they could be interrogated by KGB for an hour or two. Those conversations were recorded, and sort of people get into trouble, and they know when they cross the border, when they come back home to the home country, they know that they're on the list of politically unreliable people for just either being involved into opposition activity or for just visiting a friend who is in the opposition, or just for participating in the protests 2-3 years ago. So I would consider that a bigger threat when if you're a Belarusian citizen and if you're crossing the border with EU.
Okay. Katsiaryna, just quickly, I mean, you've mentioned several times that only 2 points are closed, but if more are shut down, will that bode badly for the relationship and what could be considered, again, those provocations, or do you not expect any more border points to be closed?
So I think it's fair to ask or to look at the statements of Lithuanian or Polish authorities. So what we know so far, what was announced, that if there are any more severe, concrete security threats or provocations, for that matter, by the Belarusian regime, then Lithuania or overall like Baltic states could consider closing the borders. I think again now it's as we've discussed, those closing of those 2 crossing points is more of a signal to Minsk to show that Baltic states closely monitor the situation. I don't think, again, we're at the point where the borders would be shut down completely. Again, like NATO allies consider scenarios, what could be done if Belarusian regime sort of conduct some major provocations or even like attacks on NATO eastern flank. Again, at this point, it sounds like a very far-fetched, unrealistic scenario. But when Belarusian, I just want to bring up one of the statements Lukashenko made a couple of years ago. He was reassuring Zelensky that Belarus would never be an accomplice. There would never be an attack from Belarusian territory on Kiev. And here we are at this point. So.
I'll tell you what, Yauheni, we have just a minute left. So why don't you just give us your final thoughts based on the last 2 analyses you heard?
Right. The final thought is that it's incorrect to say that just 2 crossing points have been shut down. Those 2 crossing points have been shut down very recently. Before that, Lithuania shut down two more when it comes to transportation, because the most recent ones are for passenger transit. Also with Poland, all but one crossing point has been shut so far. So the final thought, if we continue like this, as I said, the whole historically structural network of contacts, which has been here in the region, which has provided for regional security and person-to-person contacts, will be broken. And then all the problems that my colleagues have now spoken about will just seem so small compared to the security risk we are going to face in the region. I think this is the most important takeaway from this discussion everyone needs to keep in mind.
Okay, Yauheni Preiherman, that will have to be the final word for this edition of the Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists sincerely so much for being with us. Fascinating discussion. Our viewers, of course, for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on X, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Maryia Sadouskaya. We'll see you next time.